Assalamualaikum. Today we are going to continue with our variance analysis part 2. This time we are going to look at overhead variance. I'm your lecturer Dr. Lizz from Malaysia. Okay, there are two types of overhead variance. The first one, as you can see, is the variable overhead variance, and the other one is what we call the fixed overhead variance. So for variable overhead variance, we have two other types of variances. The first one is what we call variable overhead expenditure variance. EXP here stands for expenditure. So variable overhead expenditure variance, which is the difference in the variable overhead expenditure between what has been budgeted and also the actual variable overhead that has already been incurred. So the difference here is what we call as variable overhead expenditure variance. Okay, and then we also have variable overhead efficiency variance. So variable overhead efficiency variance, we are going to compare the standard hours that you have worked with the actual hours that you have worked and times it with the variable overhead absorption rate per hour. So this is the same like the formula that you have used when you want to calculate the direct labor efficiency variance. So we are still talking about the efficiency. Okay, we are going to try to look at the example of how to calculate the variable overhead expenditure variance and also variable overhead efficiency variance. We are going to refer to this example here. So let's try to calculate how to get the variable overhead expenditure variance first. We are still going to use the same question that we have used for the direct material and direct labor variance. So this is the standard cost cut that we have derived from this question. Alright, so we are going to focus more on the variable overhead. So as you can see in the standard cost card, it takes 0.2 hours at 3 ringgit per hour, which costs you 60 cents per unit of variable overhead. So how do we use this information so that we can solve how to calculate the variable overhead expenditure variance here? Okay, referring to our question and also the standard cost cut that we have here, then we calculate the variable overhead expenditure variance. So we take here variable overhead rate per hour. So refer to our standard cost cut. You have here VOAR per hour is here. Okay, so be careful when you want to choose which rate are you going to use. Is it VOAR per hour, which is here, or VOAR per unit, which is here. So look at the rate here. Okay, so in here we have VOAR per hour is 3 ringgit. So you just take the 3 ringgit times it with actual hours. Then you look at your question. Here it says that the actual hours work is 2,400 hours. So you just take that and then minus with the actual variable overhead cost. So here it gives you the amount of actual variable overhead cost is 4,400. Okay, so when you solve for this, then you are going to get the amount of 2,800. So when you calculate 3,400 times, you will get here 7,200 here. Okay, so what does it mean? Okay, so now we can see that VOAR at actual hours, which is your budgeted overhead here, has been set at 7,200 ringgit, but then you actually incur 4,400 ringgit only. So it means that you have spent less than what has been budgeted. So in this case, we have 2,800, and this is what we call a favorable variance because you spend less than what you have budgeted. Okay, so that is variable overhead expenditure variance. So now we look at variable overhead efficiency variance. So for variable overhead efficiency variance, we are going to use this formula, which is standard hours less actual hours times it with the VOAR per hour. So let's see how are we going to solve this. Okay, so standard hours is the same like the one that you have already calculated for your labor variance. We use the same standard hours, and standard hours here means standard hours for actual units produced. Okay, standard hours for actual units produced. That is, you can get it by using the formula standard hour per unit times it with the actual units produced, then you will get the standard hours. So in our case here, we can calculate our standard hours by you take 1 hour, 0.2 hours per unit, okay, 0.2 hours per unit times it with actual units produced. Actual units produced here is actually 8,000 units. So you are going to times it with 8,000, okay, and then after that you are going to minus it with the actual hours. Actual hours, we have already used the amount here, 2,400, and then after that times it with the variable overhead rate per hour, which is 3 ringgit. Okay, so here we have 1,600 from this calculation, and then minus with 2,400 times it with 3 ringgit. So when you solve this, you are going to get the amount of 2,400 ringgit. Okay, so when we want to see whether you have a favorable or unfavorable variance, we are going to look at whether the standard hours is actually 1,600 hours. That is how long you should take to produce 8,000 units. Okay, but in reality, you actually spend 2,400 hours to produce the same amount of product, which is 8,000 units. So from here, you can see that this is not good. Mean that you take more than what you should take to produce the same amount of units. So because of that, the 2,400 that you have here is what we call as unfavorable, or we call it adverse. Okay, so that's it for variable overhead variance. Now we are going to look at the fixed overhead variance. So for variable of fixed overhead variance, we have two types of variance. The first one is fixed overhead expenditure variance, same like the variable overhead. Okay, the formula is actual overhead minus with budgeted overhead. Okay, so using the same example, we are going to try to solve for the fixed overhead variance. So you can see that from the question, we will find the actual fixed overhead, which is here. This is the information that we are looking for. And then we are going to write it here, 7,000 minus with the budgeted fixed overhead. So to calculate the budgeted fixed overhead, you need to do some calculation. So given to you here is 1 ringgit and 20 cent per unit at 6,000 unit, which is have been budgeted. So you times it with 6,000. Some question just give you the amount of budgeted fixed overhead, but for this question it requires you to calculate the amount first. So from here we are going to get 7,000 here minus with 7,200 here. Okay, so as you can see, we are going to have a difference of 200. So is it favorable or is it adverse? So for you to calculate, you have to look at this is the amount of actual overhead that you have spent, and this is the budgeted figure. Okay, you budget for 7,200, but you actually spend for 7,000 only. So you are actually spending less than what you have budgeted. So the 200 here is what we call a favorable variance. Okay, so next one we are going to look at fixed overhead volume variance. So fixed overhead volume variance can be calculated using this formula, which is actual units produced. Okay, here we have actual units produced. Compare it with the budgeted units produced times it with the FOAR per unit. Be careful, okay? When you're talking about units, here is we are talking about units, that is actual units produced and budgeted units produced. Then the OAR that you are going to use here is also based on unit. Never take hours times with unit or hours here and units here. So you are not going to get the correct answer. So, actual units produced. From the question, you can see that 8,000 units have been produced. So, you just take the 8,000 units and then minus with budgeted units. The question tells you that 6,000 has been budgeted. So, minus with 6,000 times it the FOAR. This is where you need to look at your standard cost card again. So, for your fixed overhead cost, you have here 1 unit at 1 ringgit and 20 cent per unit. So this is what we call your FOAR. So times it here with 1 ringgit and 20 cent. So you are going to get here the amount of 2,400. Okay, so is this favorable or unfavorable? Now, what we need to see is we need to look at what you are calculating. So this is the actual units produced compared with budgeted unit. You have budgeted to produce 6,000 units, but in the end, you have actually produced 8,000 units. So you have produced more than what you have budgeted. So this is something good. So that is why 2,400 here is what we call as a favorable variance. Okay, now, so I want you to see now that for fixed overhead volume variance here, we actually have two other types of variance under it. That is fixed overhead efficiency variance and also fixed overhead capacity variance. Okay, so we look at it one by one here by referring to the same example. First, we look at fixed overhead efficiency variance. As you can see, our formula is standard hours minus with actual hours times it with the fixed overhead rate per hour. Now, if you can see here, we are using the fixed overhead rate per hour. Here also, we use the fixed overhead rate per hour. Now, as you can see, we here calculate the fixed overhead rate per unit. Okay, so here we have FOAR per unit. So before you can answer this question, you will have to convert this per unit data into per hour. So how can we do that? Okay, so it's quite easy for you to do it, for you to convert it into per unit, per hour data. So normally we follow the direct labor hour, 0.2 hour, and then add how much should it be here, so that you will have 1 ringgit and 20 cent also here. So when you calculate, then you are going to have here your rate per hour is actually 6 ringgit per hour. So 0.2, we just follow the direct labor hour because the basis asks for our rate. So 0.2 hours at 6 ringgit per hour here, you will still get 1 ringgit and 20 cent per unit. That's how you convert the unit rate onto the hourly rate. Okay, so we have calculated that. Now we want to proceed with the calculation of fixed overhead efficiency variance. Okay, you just take the standard hours. As you can see, we have already calculated the standard hours before. That is, we take the 0.2 hours times it with the 8,000 units produced. So here you get 1,600 hours. Minus with the actual hours. This is our actual hours that we have worked, 2,400 hours. So minus 2,400 times it with the FOAR per hour. Per hour is this one, 6 ringgit. Per unit is this one, 120. So don't get mixed up. Okay, so you just time it with 6 ringgit, here. So what we will have after that will be 4,800. Okay, so this is efficiency that we are talking about. It takes standard hours should be 1,600, but you take 2,400 hours. So of course you take longer than necessary. So this is what we call unfavorable or adverse variance, which is not good. Okay, so you are not that efficient from this calculation. Okay, so now we want to look further. We want to look further for the fixed overhead capacity variance. How do we calculate the fixed overhead capacity variance? Okay, so here the formula is to use the actual hours. So we already know the actual hours is 2,400 minus with budgeted hours. Okay, so far we have not yet calculated the budgeted hours. So you can calculate the budgeted hours using the formula of standard hour per unit times it with the budgeted units produced. Okay, so we have standard hours per unit, as you can see here, is 0.2 hours times it with the budgeted units produced, which is 6,000. So you times it with 6,000, then you will get the amount of budgeted hours, and and then times it with fixed overhead rate per hour. So we have here 6 ringgit again. So when you solve for that, we are going to have 2,400 minus with 1,200, then times it with 6. Then we will get here the answer of 7,200. So what does this 7,200 means? Okay, so as you can see, this is the actual hours work. Okay, we are talking about capacity here, capacity. So when we talk about capacity, we always want to have bigger capacity. Okay, so your capacity, actual capacity is 2,400, but then you budget only for 1,200. As you can see, you have budgeted less than what you actually have. So this is actually something good, because you have the bigger capacity than what you have expected. Therefore, we can say that the 7,200 there is a favorable variance. Okay, so when you total up these two here, you are going to get what we call fixed overhead volume variance. You see, from here, fixed overhead volume variance. How much would the fixed overhead volume variance be? You just total up these two figures, 4,800 with 7,200. So here you are going to get the amount of 2,400, which is favorable. Remember, don't just total up this figure and this figure. You also need to consider the favorable or unfavorable. So here you get 2,400 favorable. Okay, so when we go back to our first calculation, as you can see here, then that our fixed overhead volume variance here that consists of two other variance, which is fixed overhead efficiency and fixed overhead capacity variance. The total here is 2,400, which is actually, if you total up these two, then you will get back this figure, exactly 2,400 favorable variance. Okay, so as you can see, as for now, we have learned about fixed overhead variance and also variable overhead variance. So I sum up what we have learned. We are talking about overhead variance, which consists of two types, which is variable overhead and fixed overhead. For variable overhead, we have variable overhead expenditure variance, variable overhead efficiency variance. And then for fixed overhead variance, we also have two types, which is fixed overhead expenditure variance and also fixed overhead volume variance. Okay, so when we look further, you can see here that fixed overhead volume variance then can be divided into two. There are two types of fixed overhead volume variance, which is fixed overhead efficiency variance and fixed overhead capacity variance. So when you calculate the fixed overhead volume variance, you are going to get the same answer when you total up these two variances. Okay, so that is all for overhead variance. So I'll see you again next time. Thank you. Study hard. Alright. La ilaha illallah, benda pulak ni.